Welcome. This is the assignment that you have received from me today. It's titled Limiting Factors. We talked about much of this stuff in our last class. This text will kind of reinforce some of those things that we had spoken of a short while ago. Now, I did modify some of our directions for what we're going to be doing with marking the text here. We're really going to focus today on just getting acclimated or used to or comfortable with some of the vocabulary terms that we do not know. The words may be some of these bolded ones, which are vocab words tied to directly what we're knowing, or they might be some of the ones that are not bolded, that are just general words that we may not know. So we're going to look to locate those words and also at the same time try to define them within the reading itself. And lastly, we're going to try to make connections in the text. And what I mean by making connections is drawing lines with the explanation for the line. And you'll kind of see what I'm doing, and I'll come back and reference this as we're kind of going through this. In this video, we're going to go through this first paragraph together so that you can kind of get used to how to mark the text relative to what our target is for today, highlighting words, defining them, making connections. So follow along on your own handout as we go through. Feel free to pause the video to make any edits to this document that you might need. You can always pause and press play when you are ready to start moving forward with the video. So we previously learned about how population size grows. Populations, that might be a new word. It's definitely a bolded word, so it's definitely going to be one that I am highlighting. Now again, as we go through, I'm going to try to define them and also try to make connections to other parts of the text. What can I connect population size or populations to? During periods of exponential growth, another vocabulary term. And as I start to look at population or exponential growth, I maybe ask myself, what is it? If I come across a word and I don't know what it is, hopefully I can figure out what it is as I kind of read through. During periods of exponential growth, the population has an abundance of resources. Abundance might be a word you do not know. Same with resources. That might actually be two words. So what is it? Exponential growth. It's a population that has an abundance of resources. So here's a connection. Exponential growth happens when that exists. That is a connection. And this is exactly what I mean by a connection. I'm drawing a line. I'm explaining why that line is there because it's connecting this to this. So what happens when the population has an abundance of resources? Same sentence. I'm betting, since this is the same sentence, that we're going to get an example or two of what we mean by abundance of resources. The population has food for everyone. Food for everyone. That looks like an example of what we mean by an abundance of resource. So if there is an abundance of resource, what is an example? Food for everyone. There are no or very few predators to eat the population. Plenty of space. We talked about space as having been a resource. That looks like a second example. Plenty of space, so there is no crowding. There is shelter for all. That looks like a third example of what we mean by abundance of resources. So at this point, you should start to be able to define the word abundance if you did not know it already. Plenty of space, shelter for all, food for everyone. My definition of abundance because the definition is flat out not said in here. The definition would be maybe a lot or enough. I have just defined that word, if I did not know it, based on the context clues within the paragraph. Moving on. When we compared exponential growth, okay, I already highlighted it here, so I'm not again. When I compared exponential growth to logistic growth, we learned that populations do tend to grow exponentially for a while. Okay, so if this is a population growth and this is a population growth, I'm reading here that populations, they do grow this way for a little while. That means that there must be something in common with these two growths. What is the same? Maybe also we might be asking ourselves, what is different? Well, in terms of the same, we kind of see that right here. Populations tend to grow exponentially for a little while. And we know that because it says when we compared this one to this one. That means that we saw this happening in this as well as that. So that would be the same. Again, making connections. But eventually those resources start to put pressure. Pressure. When you hear the word pressure, you might know the word pressure, but this is a word that has multiple definitions. Pressure might be referring to the amount of pressure in a basketball, how much air is in the basketball, or in the tires in the car. But somehow that definition doesn't seem to fit what we're reading here. Maybe we can find a different definition to the word pressure. So we start to put pressure from the resources on the growing population. Okay, what's putting pressure? Looks like the resources. So it looks like resources cause pressure. That's what I'm seeing. Perhaps there are so many individuals in the population that not all will get food. Not all will get food. Or maybe there are no more spaces to provide shelter. No more space to provide shelter. Going back to the sentence with pressure, it looks like as we kind of continue to read, we're starting to get examples of exactly what we mean by pressure. We know that food is a resource. We know that shelter is a resource. Using that context clue, I can start to kind of gather that those must be examples of what we're talking about with pressure. So, maybe examples, and then boom, boom. Now I've identified what we mean by pressure. Now it's a little bit more clear. Moving on. In this case, things in the environment limit the number of individuals that can receive necessary resources to stay alive. Okay. So the pressure limits the number of resources. That looks like it is a cause of pressure. So it results in, or leads to, or causes that to occur. When pressure is applied to a population, not all will stay alive. This number, or level, of individuals that an environment can support is what we learn to be the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is a word, and this one is nice because it was defined right in the same sentence. It's telling us that this is what's going on, and that's what it's called. Number of individuals an environment can support. That would be our definition. Again, I'm making a connection between this vocabulary word, a word that we probably are not too comfortable with, and we're actually defining it. So number of individuals an environment can support is the carrying capacity, and the environmental conditions that limit the size of a population are known as limiting factors. Limiting factors. What is a limiting factor? It looks like it also explained that in here. Let's go back. Environmental conditions that limit the size of a population. Looks like that is our definition to that. And we can make a connection right there. Maybe we're not quite sure of the word limit. That might be a word that we highlight. But if we're talking about the word limit, and if we think about the things that we talked about, not all will get food. No more place to provide shelter. Limit the number of individuals that can stay alive. Limit, if we weren't sure what this meant, limit the size of a population, we can now start to connect to some of these other things. And we can define limit as really how many stay alive. I know that's getting tough to read. You might want to use some of your margin space off to the sides. But this is exactly what we do when we mark text. And it's very tough to say that when you've done this, that you have not applied thought as you're kind of working through. You had to think, because you can't draw this line if thought wasn't put into it.